What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, Tony Werfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed last week. I thought that was kind of fun to do, talking about relationship, and I'm glad so many of you met Danielle. I had a lot of comments of, hey, she sounds super nice. Anyways, yeah, she is. She is really nice. And if you want to hear that whole conversation that we were referring to, the link is actually found underneath the podcast in the description, so you can click on that and kind of hear the whole story. It's pretty interesting. But today I want to touch on a story that I remember hearing from time to time while I'd sit there in these youth classes, and I'd watch on the felt board as like these felts would move, and like the voice of my parents, they'd narrate this really odd, epic story. And in this epic story, there was this guy named Joshua, and he had this battle. And it was a battle in which the story tells us that the sun, it actually stops rotating around the earth, and time kind of just like it stands still. So I remember trying to process this as a kid. I was an odd kid anyways, but I remember thinking, like, how does time stand still? And even more so, like, can I harness this too? Can I ask God to make time stand still? Because if I could, then like I could rob banks, I could eat chocolate, I could steal a kiss from Raquel. Like, oh, the fun I would have, like typical stuff a kid would think, or maybe just an oddball kid like me. But I remember thinking this story is just so different. But today I read the story a little differently. And after taking some time to understand science and history, basically the historic events of these nomadic people and the various contexts that need addressing, I've actually found this to be a really compelling story. So the main character's name is Joshua, and the story is found in Judges, and it's basically a book essentially showing these various leaders and their connection to Israel's identity. So it's all told in this really epic fashion. It's how they wrote. So everything is larger, it's bigger, it's more extravagant. The story is huge, and that's the point. It's told epically. So Joshua, what he is he's a reflection of Moses, which is pretty standard for these stories. Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joshua, they all have almost the exact same plots, which really, they're all mini Israels. They're the picture of Israel. So he's supposed to go out and like plant the seeds of Torah in the land of Israel. So in the wilderness, Moses, they lived inside of these miracles. There was like food and water and protection. But now that's all gone. They've moved past that. And now they would have to do like the hard work of plowing and planting and digging wells, fighting battles. So this is kind of where the story goes. So Joshua, he has to divide the land among all these tribes. He has to establish borders. He had to keep Israel united, even when 2.5 of these tribes, they choose to remain on the east bank of the Jordan. So all of this going on. And yet we're told this Joshua character, which is a character that always kind of has this connection to redemption, he actually succeeds in uniting Israel. And so what the writers want you to understand is that Israel used to be united, but because they didn't follow the wisdom traditions and everything, they started to fragment and weaken. And so the authors want their people to understand that they believe their tribe was weakened because they lost their identity. So it's also important to understand what the authors, they make use of lots of war imagery. And some people, I've heard them oftentimes refer to the Bible, they're like, it's so archaic, all these wars, all this terrible stuff going on. Why talk about it? Why use it? I would argue this. It's because this is where they were culturally. For them, their gods were gods of war. And Israel's God was a mighty warrior, right? Who preserved his people through mighty conquests. That was their idea. So in much of the Old Testament, you'll read lots of war imagery, because that's the way tribes would write of their tribes and their God's strength. But remember, they're on a trajectory. So in chapters 1 through 9 in Judges, essentially the writers, they plot out all the battles won and the tribe learning to get along. So that's really important for these tribal people. They're winning all these battles, so their God must be on their side. And so then in chapter 10, it brings up this hotly debated miracle story. And so the story kind of goes like this. There's this empire, this city, Gibeon. And Gibeon ends up making this peace treaty with Israel. And all the surrounding tribes, they start freaking out because Gibeon is now connected to Israel. So of course these tribes, they go and they're going to battle Gibeon and destroy Gibeon before it gets too powerful. So Gibeon of course calls on Joshua to save the day. There's this epic movement where Joshua and all of his troops, they walk 20 miles on feet. They're exhausted. They get into the battle and things are going crazy. There's like hailstorms falling on the enemy, all this stuff. It's epic. It's what epics do. And in the middle of this, Joshua and his troops, again, you can just like, epic stories. Joshua and his troops, I just said, Joshua and his troops, they push back the enemy and the enemy starts retreating. Of course, again, epic stories. And so Joshua, he's so hardcore, he needs more time. And so the story goes that Joshua actually calls out to God, give me more time. And in the middle of this, the story says, and again, one that has Christians like not sure what to do with it. The story goes that in the midst of this, Joshua cries out and his God answers the call and causes the sun to stop rotating around the earth. Stops rotating around the earth. So essentially 6.6 sextillion tons spinning gravel and water, it comes to a complete stop. So again, this has for many of us kind of scratching our head because there are obvious problems with this, right? First of all, the sun, it doesn't rotate around the earth. So this has to be read a little differently. So again, sorry literalists who believe, the Bible tells me so, I just believe it. Joshua is just simply, this story, there's some problems here. Let's just admit that. So think about this. Also, these problems. Galileo, he said to the church, the earth is not the center of our galaxy, but the sun was. And so this whole idea was so shocking that it almost like had him killed by, of course, the church. And the idea was, if this is true, it causes the accuracy of this story, Joshua, it causes that to be questioned. And so scientifically, if the earth truly did stop rotating, it would cause a huge disaster. Land masses would basically wipe clean of anything not attached to bedrock. And the oceans, of course, then would be totally emptied onto landmass. All life would be gone. So what do you do with this story? Because obviously the earth did not stop rotating. So does this God create natural laws by which the universe lives, breathes, moves, only to break them in order to let one small tribe destroy another? Seems a little bit crazy to me. So there are some interpretations, and I'll explain this, and I'll briefly share them with you. Not all of them, but I'll just share some of the popular ones I often get from people. Because when I talk about the Bible and how oftentimes when you take it literally, it really skews things, people get a bit defensive. And I've heard all kinds of responses to this. So here's a couple. One of them is, of course, God literally stopped the rotation of the earth, the sun, and essentially the galaxy, all for this tribe of Israel to win a battle over its neighboring enemies. But of course, there is a problem with this. Because again, does this God of love create laws for the universe only to break them? Did he really want his people to kill one another and find new ways for them to have more time to do so? Is that what's going on here? This literal interpretation, it totally falls short when you consider science and the view of the divine that Jesus seems to share. So another idea I've had, and I actually had a man come up and say this to me. He said, no, I know what happened. It was an eclipse. He was so he nailed it. He was like, yes, it's an eclipse. I know it. The problem with an eclipse, eclipses are something we can predict. We can actually predict them with a lot of accuracy. So when taking the time and the dates that this would have occurred, if we take it literally into consideration, this wouldn't add up to be one of those days. And if it did, it would be like an 8-minute period. So that's not really enough time for anyone to catch their breath. 8 minutes, probably not enough time. So that idea, I think we just we drop. Another one that I've had people say is, well, maybe the Earth slowed, but maybe it just slowed but didn't stop. So that would cause like the time to be kind of prolonged. Maybe instead of 24, you got 48 hours, right? So people have told me that. Again, scientifically, it doesn't pan out. To slow the Earth down at that kind of pace, it would actually take 4 to 10 months of slowing. And that's not even considering the changes in the atmosphere. So that idea doesn't work either. Other tribes, another idea is other tribes around the world, they have other stories of a dark day. So this must be true. But again, when you look at history and you look at these tribes with their dark day, you'll notice they all happen at different time periods. None of them seem to fit together to make this even close to a valid argument. So these interpretations that attempt to hold on to a literal event, they just don't work. And in truth, it makes people kind of look foolish when you try to literalize the story. So here's how I look at it. This is an epic piece of literature, and it's describing an account when the sun felt like it lessened in strength. The writers of Joshua, they're using hyperbole. They're talking about an event where time felt like it stood still. And so I'm learning to remember when I'm reading the Old Testament, these are people who were writing this to help their tribe remain, to help them keep their identity. So here's the interesting thing. Israel, they're marched hundreds of miles, taken captive by Babylon, brought to a new empire with new gods, varying languages. Some of the Israelites, though, they're getting really good at assimilating. And there's a real danger that they were going to watch their tribe lose its identity. So again, what do? They write the stories that show their nation's identity, where they've been, what they valued, what they believed, what their downfalls have been, what they hope for. And so these writings were meant to unite a people that were divided. So if they could learn to embrace one another as brothers and sisters, even though they were split from north and south, broken up in tribes who basically battled one another for a super long time, they could experience a miracle if they could come together. And so when the miracle happens, it causes time to feel as though it's standing still. Come on, are you getting it? I think we've all experienced these moments, haven't we? We'll say things like, I just feel, it felt like time slowed. Time stood still. I've witnessed these moments, and I've heard people talk of these moments. One of my favorite writers, Jack Kerouac, he's a beat writer. He wrote of a moment like this in his novel On the Road, and I've always enjoyed this one. He says this, and for just a moment, I had reached the point of ecstasy that I always wanted to reach, which was the complete step across chronological time into timeless shadows, and wonderment in the bleakness of the mortal realm, and the sensation of death kicking at my heels to move on with a phantom dogging its own heels. You got to read that book. So good. But here's the idea. For him, this moment felt like time stopped. Everything slowed. So the reality is, it didn't actually literally happen. What happened is the moment was heavy. It was profound. It meant something. Time stood still. And we have a history of these moments, don't we? Like the Berlin Wall, dividing East and West, it comes down in November 9, 1989. And I was sitting there, I was watching as a close family friend who had lived there his whole life. He turned to me when we were watching the television, and he said, "This moment, it means the world to me. No more separation." For him, that moment is going to be forever remembered, because for him, it felt like time stood still. I look back at history. July 16, 1969, we land on the moon. And the world, they watched and they listened in slow motion as Neil Armstrong, he says those famous lines. He says, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." That moment it forever unites us. August 28, 1963. Martin Luther gave one of the most compelling speeches in history. Martin Luther King Jr., right there in the front of the steps of Lincoln Memorial. Over 250,000 people. And it brought two different groups together. One of my favorite quotes from a Boston Globe writer, he wrote, "We were transfixed. He made time stand still. The world halted for a moment and caused our humanity to connect us once again." So again, time stood still. People felt united. 9/11. Two planes crashed into the World Trade Center. Another one in the Pentagon. 2,996 people killed, over 6,000 injured. So I was in a place watching, just like you were. And I'm sitting in a class that's supposed to help me become a better speaker. And the teacher came in, and I remember him sharing the news. Everyone on campus started walking toward the student center, and it was packed. And I remember watching on the television screens that they set up, I watched as that second plane hit the tower. And I remember everything just feeling like it's underwater. It's just everything is slowed. And we all watched these painful actions. And then I remember we gathered together in groups there at the center of campus. People were crying, hugging, praying. They were connecting. They were becoming one. And I remember thinking, time stood still in that moment of tragedy. And I've seen these moments. I've experienced these beautiful moments, and I think so have you. And they're what we talk about when we desire to bring unity. There are human stories. The Joshua story, this battle, was their story. Not to be taken literally, it was an epic story, but it was their story, a battle that was won. And so stories of loss and pain, victory, celebration, those are what unite us. So I might ask you, when in your life have you experienced one of those moments? You might even call it a miracle, right? A time when time seems to stand still and cause people to be one again. Sometimes I think it takes stopping and simply allowing yourself to just be in the moment. Other times it means running toward injustice in order to bring peace, restoration, find you're not alone. For me, I've got two stories I want to end on. Two stories when time felt like it just kind of stood still. And for me, it's a story about my grandpa and Wendy Ellis. So let me share these with you. Growing up, I was always super close to my grandpa Henry. And I basically lived at their house, and my parents, they worked long days to get their education. And so Grandpa, he taught me so much. And I remember one day after this really tough day of first grade, I came back to his house in tears because my shoelaces, they came apart again. I remember my parents, they said, "No more Velcro. We're not doing Velcro anymore." And it just crushed my soul, right? Because I couldn't tie my shoes. And so I was the only one struggling with it in my classroom. And I remember being teased, and I felt worthless. And kept thinking I'd probably I'd probably have to go back to Velcro, wear it into my 20s, 30s. I'd be that awkward guy. So I finally tell Grandpa, and he sits down with me, and he tells me, "It's okay, Tony. It's okay. Let me teach you how to tie your shoes." And so my grandpa, he gave me this adage. He said, "Cross 'em, loop 'em, swoop 'em." And this is who Grandpa was for me. And as I grew up, I watched as Grandpa, he slowly aged. He became weaker and weaker. And it was so difficult for me because here was this man who I grew up with just idolizing. He was so incredible. He taught me so much. But I had to watch as he got weaker and weaker and weaker. And I remember one day I came back to visit him from college, and I got this call from Grandma. And she basically said, "Grandpa's not doing well. You need to come see him." And so when I got there, I realized really quick, he needed to go to the hospital. And so I sat in this ambulance with him, walked into the x-ray room, helped him into new clothes. And I found out that day Grandpa actually had a stroke. And the left side of his body, it actually left it paralyzed. And so I remember a couple days later, I was in the room with him. And he said, "Tony, my feet are cold." He wanted his shoes back on. And so I took his shoes and I began putting them on his feet. And then I remember tying them for my grandpa. And as I did, he says something in his slurred speech, and it made me completely come undone. I started crying. He said, "Cross 'em, loop 'em, swoop 'em. Cross 'em, loop 'em, swoop 'em." And it was just so beautiful. And I remember it feeling like time, it just stood still. And I looked at my grandpa and I felt so much love and so much respect for this guy, this amazing man. Cross him, loop him, swoop him. Time just absolutely stood still. It was a beautiful moment. I will cherish the rest of my life. I have another moment that came to my mind. And this one's a little more lighthearted. It happened in my adolescent days when me and some friends, we had a bully. There was this bully that tormented our neighborhood. And we were all around maybe 10 years old, 12. He was probably maybe only 13 or 14, I don't remember. But he seemed like a giant. He was one of those kids. And he would tease us, he would punch us, pick us up, steal our basketball when we'd be playing at the court. He was just a jerk. And we all complained about him, but we were all terrified of him. Until one summer, a new girl came to stay with her grandma in our neighborhood, and her name was Wendy. And she was beautiful. She played sports just as well as most of us other guys, and we all had the secret crush on her. And so one afternoon, I remember we're playing basketball, and this bully, his name is Austin, he came and he started picking on us. But something happened. Wendy happened. And I'll never forget it. I'm 37 years old, and I look back and it just makes me laugh still. Because she starts walking toward him and she's like pointing her finger at him. "Who do you think you are?" And she gets right in his face. And the first time in all of our lives, we see that he actually looks frightened. And I remember thinking like, "Go Wendy, she's about to take this kid down." And then the unthinkable happens. Austin turns and he punches her right in the face. That dude punched her in the face. He punched a girl in the face, and it wasn't just any girl, this was my girl. I remember seeing her fall to the ground holding her face. And in that moment, I remember just something clicking. And it was like this animal-like rage. And I remember feeling hot and my fists clenching, and something like snapped in me. And I'll never forget it because I just started running toward him. And to this day, I have no idea what I was planning on doing when I caught him. But I was running toward him. I was screaming. I don't even remember what I'm screaming. It could have been like freedom, for all I know. But my fists, they're clenched and I'm running. And then it hits me. It was like slow motion. Because I noticed in that moment, I wasn't alone. All the other guys, they were running next to me and they were screaming. All of us guys who loved Wendy, we were running toward him, fists clenched, and we were ready to tear this dude to pieces. We were so angry. How dare him punch Wendy? And in that moment, time stood still. In that moment of awe, I noticed the look on his face, like he just realized what he'd done. And in his panic, I remember he turns and he ran. And all of us, we chased him down the street, and it felt like miles, but it was really only a couple blocks. And we all kind of slowed and watched him keep running. And even Wendy joined in the run. And And I remember we stopped, we caught our breath, and I remember as a group looking at Wendy, and she just started laughing, and all of us started laughing. And it's a beautiful childhood memory, and I'll never forget it. And for me, it was the day that time just stood still. I fought against injustice, and in doing so, I realized I wasn't alone. And isn't this what happens? What happens when we allow ourselves to become one? When we rise together, experience something bigger than ourselves? Because the miraculous for me, it happens when we lay down our differences and we fight against the darkness in the world, the injustice. Because for the ancients, the ones actually writing these stories, they were writing in order to remember who they were, to remember the moments that unite them. And so maybe this is something we need to be doing too. Maybe we need to learn to share our moments with those around us, because when we share those moments, it actually unites us. It gives us power to knock down walls, show compassion, give compelling speeches, maybe walk on new territory never traveled before, fight against the bullies. And I would say we fight differently. We fight with love. We battle evil by not seeking more revenge, but maybe mercy. Maybe we don't seek to destroy other armies, but we learn to repair relationships. And when humanity is found doing this, that's when this kingdom of heaven, it becomes a reality here and now. And my prayer is that we seek out these moments every day. Maybe we start looking for opportunities to unite people rather than cause separation. And maybe your next Facebook post, you consider finding ways to unite people rather than continuing to separate. Maybe we take time today to share those moments with people around us, those stories that united. Maybe we become the kingdom this first century Jewish rabbi believed we could. I think when we share those moments when time stood still, what it does is it causes all of us to come together, to unite, and begin thinking of the world and the issues and the victories in a bigger way. I think when we do this, we become one. And so Joshua and the longest day probably didn't literally happen, but something much bigger took place because these tribes became one. And my prayer is that you and I and the communities we're in would slowly begin sharing our stories and also become one. Blessings this week. And as always, check out my page, TonyWerfel.com. Just put up a new blog post and it's already gotten a lot of attention. Check it out. Anyways, take care, everyone, and we'll talk next week. Bye.